Like I estimate more than 2 million deaths that Johnson & Johnson has caused is roughly twice the number of deaths from all the wars in all of American history. Johnson & Johnson just told the rest of the world to take a hike. It had tested the drug 20 times in children in 20 separate clinical trials, all of which had failed. Why are babies dying? This drug is not approved for use in children. Why are doctors using it?
And the evidence was damning, but it seems like there was a lot of corporate arrogance, fudged data, manipulated clinical trials, manipulated the FDA also. How would they pull it off for so many years?
So the company was lying to the FDA, lying to doctors.
There's another book out called the Johnson & Johnson Files, which is about the hip implants gone wrong in India.
Right.
Today we'll be talking to somebody very, very interesting. I'm joined by author and journalist who has seen power up close. We'll be speaking to Gardiner Harris, which many Indians will remember very fondly. Gardiner has... Now, of course, very fondly. As someone who has seen power up close, you spent years uncovering uncomfortable truths. You've been a White House correspondent, a diplomatic writer, public health and pharma beat with the New York Times. I mean, incredible stuff, right? And today we'll be talking about Gardiner's new book, which is No More Tears, The Dark Secrets of Johnson & Johnson, the pharmaceutical company, which is... I wish it were a work of fiction. Unfortunately, it's not, but it's an absolute thriller, a page turner. Everybody, whether you consume a medicine or not, if you're a consumer of a talcum powder or even a cosmetic, you have to read it. Gardiner, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining in. What a pleasure to have you over.
Thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be talking to you, Anu.
Likewise. I must congratulate you. Superlatively well-researched book. I mean, 80 or 90 pages of references. That's amazing. And you managed to get the grand jury trials and everything. Yeah. And for the rest of us who thought that baby powder was harmless and that regulatory bodies had our back, we are in for a surprise, right? Like, tell us, how did it all start?
So, Anu, thanks so much for having me. Obviously, this is a book. It took me a little more than 5 years to research and write this book. And that was after essentially a 20-year reporting career in which I spent many years in conversation with Johnson & Johnson and its executives, knowing a lot of Johnson & Johnson executives, and then knowing many of the whistleblowers. In sort of all together, probably this book took me something on the order of 7 years of work. And I did it because... Anu, you've spent time in Princeton, New Jersey, which is right close to where Johnson & Johnson is headquartered, and I grew up there as well. And we were both infused with this notion that Johnson & Johnson was the most ethical company on the planet. It had this, they call it a credo, I think the rest of us would pronounce it credo, about how they always put doctors and patients and mothers and babies first before profits. There was this whole story about how they handled the 1982 Tylenol poisoning scare that was taught in business schools. You yourself went to business school, almost certainly was taught that case study, that its response was ideal. Again, they put people before profits, and that it was really kind of the ideal corporation in the world, and almost an ideal of the entire economic system, that you could do well and that you could also do good for all of us. And as I started digging into the company as the Pharma reporter, first at the Wall Street Journal and then at the New York Times, like again and again and again, their actions entirely contradicted this image that you and I had very strongly. The first one had a real Indian component that you will remember. Remember, at the end of the 20th century, there was this big scandal about AIDS in Africa, and that the entire continent would soon be kind of wiped away, and that they couldn't possibly afford these new antiretroviral, the new anti-HIV drugs that had been developed in the United States largely. And the makers of those drugs sort of shrugged and said, the price is the price. And an international firestorm enveloped them. And soon enough, basically, the entire world said, you cannot allow a continent to die. And so the industry agreed, partnered, as you might recall, with Hamid, my old friend, the chairman of CIPLA, Yusuf Hamid, and Yusuf Hamid was able to get the cocktail of medicines down to less than $1 a day. So it was really sort of American innovation and in Indian manufacturing, the two of them together, that saved the African continent. And the Indians were only kind of able to do their magic because these pharmaceutical companies essentially agreed not to enforce their patents globally, and certainly not in Africa or in India. And the one holdout of this entire campaign was Johnson & Johnson. They were the only major manufacturer of AIDS drugs to say no. We will not allow the Indians to copy our medicines. We will not give the patents to UNAIDS, this organization that sprang up to essentially guard the patents for the industry to allow these drugs to be sold, essentially in the developing world. And Johnson & Johnson just told the rest of the world to take a hike. And at the time, I just was like, how is this possible? Like, this is the most ethical company in the world, and it is the lone holdout? Like, what? And I couldn't really believe it. And what was so interesting, Anu, is that it didn't make any news. Like, I wrote about it, but nobody really picked it up because I think there was this just sort of general disbelief. Well, it's a great company. They must have a good reason. And again and again and again, I would write tough stories on Johnson & Johnson, and that was always the reaction, which was these were always seen as sort of one-off. Well, they must have made a mistake here, but they're a good company. And this really came home to me when my own son spent several days in a NICU unit. He had a very difficult birth. He sort of collapsed soon after birth. And if you've had children, you know that those early days are wrenching. He was my first child, and it's a remarkable thing when you turn into a parent, I think, particularly as a father, because, of course, you women have this thing growing inside of you for 9 months, and we guys are just, kind of going along like nothing's changed, and then suddenly this being emerges who's attached to you and
you're supposed to take care of it.
Yeah, and has this grip on the taproot to your soul. And I'm suddenly completely taken over with love for this creature. And kind of, even though my mother had died, I'd had all kinds of tragedy in my life, I had never experienced that kind of emotional tumult. And this is back in the day, there was no paternity leave. So as soon as he kind of got out of the hospital and got home, I went right back to work. And within days, received this cache of documents from a whistleblower showing how Johnson & Johnson had secretly sold a heartburn medicine called Propulsid to NICU doctors around the country as a cure for spit up, which is a common problem for preemies in particular. And they had suggested that this drug would be helpful in spit up, even though the company knew two things. One, it had tested the drug 20 times in children in 20 separate clinical trials, all of which had failed. And two, the drug was unusually toxic to preemies because it caused something called QT prolongation, which is a heart arrhythmia that is particularly dangerous in preemies and young infants because you cause an arrhythmia in a child, their heart stops, and that's it. So this pile of dead babies was getting larger and larger and larger. And within Johnson & Johnson, there were all these communications of alarm, like, what are we doing? And the FDA kept sending Johnson & Johnson alarm about these dead babies. Why are babies dying? This drug is not approved for use in children. Why are doctors using it? And of course, Johnson & Johnson was sending notes back to the FDA and having meetings saying, we don't know why doctors are using this, even though Johnson & Johnson was underwriting
it,
an illegal marketing campaign to those very doctors, telling them to use it. So the company was lying to the FDA, lying to doctors, and babies were dying. And babies just like mine, who had been in a NICU unit. And I looked at these documents. I was like, how is this possible?
Yeah.
And then, as I tell in the book, I met a Johnson & Johnson sales rep like 8 or 9 months later who told me a terrifying story about her own nephew being endangered by a drug that she herself was selling. And then I knew I had to do something about this. This was happening again and again. And I eventually estimate, I tell stories first about baby powder, and then about Tylenol, how dangerous it really is, about EPO, this cancer medicine that actually India has a role in that. I didn't tell this story because India briefly thought about doing, taking the patent for EPO back in the 90s, and it didn't happen. There was a negotiation, but Johnson & Johnson sold this drug as a cure for cancer, even though it knew that EPO is actually miracle grow to tumors. And instead of saving people and helping them,
killing people.
Kill them. And then they did the same thing with Risperdal, where they created the worst pediatric drug crisis ever and killed more than 1 million Americans. I estimate in this book that through these various products I knew, including a poisonous hip implant, terrible vaginal mesh, which, by the way, there's a new book coming out in India about the vaginal mesh story in India. I estimate more than 2 million Americans had their deaths accelerated or caused by Johnson & Johnson.
2 million?
2 million. It's in the book. The number is in the book.
Yeah.
And again, we're talking about just the United States. Once these products are essentially in India, this number goes up to who knows how many. So that's why I did the book.
Just for reference, 2 million is a number which if you spread across would be a sizable big war going around, and that would kill as many people. 2 million is a huge number. Numbers sometimes don't sink in when.
No, it's almost twice as many people who have died in all of the wars in all of American history. It's 2 million. The United States has had roughly 600, 700,000 casualties in war for all of the wars, from the Revolutionary War through World War II, all the rest. If you count all the people who died of disease and other causes, it gets close to 1 million. So 2 million deaths that Johnson & Johnson has caused is roughly twice the number of deaths from all the wars in all of American history.
And like you mentioned in the book, this is happening because people not just have a rational trust on Johnson & Johnson, there is an emotional trust because of how it is projected. And even the cover of your book, you use the tagline, no more tears, to tell how much of tears have they caused throughout very, very long duration of time. Here, I'd like to bring our viewers a notice to something, that there is another book out called the Johnson & Johnson Files, which we will be talking about next week, which is about the hip implants gone wrong in India. So you talk about this in the US, and this book talks about how many hip implants from the J&J product have gone wrong in India and how no compensation happened. And the vaginal mesh, as you said, the book is coming out. I think in the book you mentioned about 9 products, like you deep dive into about 9 products.
And I do the hips, I do the vaginal mesh. Yes. I don't do the India side of those stories, just because it just was too much.
It was too much, yeah. No, but it's a superlatively well-researched book. And what really catches my eye the first time is, of course, let's start with the talcum case. The company knew all along that talcum is problematic. And initially, maybe not, because the world was okay with asbestos, but later the evidence was damning. But it seems like there was a lot of corporate arrogance where they refused to actually look into the evidence and fudged data, manipulated clinical trials, manipulated the FDA also. How did they pull it off for so many years?
Anu, you were a lawyer, and this book is, the first target of this book is obviously Johnson & Johnson. The second target of this book is FDA and the regulatory structure around healthcare in the United States and really the rest of the world, of course. The third target of this book is the professional class. Doctors, lawyers, academics, who really serve as the co-conspirators to a whole series of massive crimes that I argue these are the largest, costliest, deadliest criminal conspiracies in American history. Nothing else is close. And the only way that Johnson & Johnson gets away with all of this stuff is first capturing the FDA. The FDA now gets most of its money from fees paid directly by companies like Johnson & Johnson, and FDA executives routinely say in speeches that the industry is its customer. It's not the consumer, it's not the American public, it's the industry. But finally, what's perhaps most shocking to me are the number of doctors who simply allow their prescription pad to be bought by this company and will use drugs, devices, and these products very dangerously because the company is paying them to, and the number of lawyers who are willing to lie under oath, lie to courts, say knowingly false things in court to help their client. And the story, one of the sort of shocking parts, and maybe it's not shocking to the rest of the people, I happen to know a lot of lawyers, thought about going to law school myself. I admire them. I think lawyers generally are trying to do the right thing. In the case of Johnson's baby powder, what you see is decades of lawyers at the highest level knowingly hiding the proof that Johnson's baby powder was contaminated with asbestos, knowingly lying to courts about it and refusing to allow these documents that show this contamination to be brought into lawsuits, and doing this essentially protecting this company and allowing it to poison half of all American infants and an even greater share of American mothers and women over the course of more than a century. And it was really yes, Johnson & Johnson executives lied, and they have now, their own representatives in court now admit that many of the statements that Johnson & Johnson executives made over decades were knowing lies made under oath, that they perjured themselves. And that is shocking in and of itself. But that these independent lawyers at independent, highly thought of law firms, these are people who hold, who carry out charitable dinners and everyone thinks is sort of person of the year. And these people are spending their work days lying about a poisonous product for babies. It for years and years and years at a time, and paying for second homes with the money that Johnson & Johnson gives them to lie so that Johnson & Johnson can poison babies.
How sad is that? I mean, when you look at the Johnson & Johnson case, especially in this book, it's starting from what you say, preemies, children, right, young adults when it comes to ADHD, then older people, women, right, vaginal mesh, hip implants, and finally elderly people who are given overdoses. I mean, it's the whole spectrum. It's a lifetime of right, being poisoned, right? And 2 million deaths across.
Yeah, so there's 3 or 4 products I talk about in which they knowingly poisoned babies. There are 3 or 4 products I talk about, and I didn't even go into the details of many of these, in which they knowingly poison women's reproductive systems, right? Vaginal mesh we know about. They knew before they started even selling this product that roughly a third of women who use this product would never have vaginal sex again. And of course, as we talk about,
and the pain and a lifelong of pain,
a lifelong of pain, and a lifelong of dripping blood out of their bodies, like not menstrual blood. We're talking about their vaginal walls seeping blood permanently for the rest of their lives, right? So you can never wear a skirt again. You could never go into a pool with a bathing suit. You can't do any of, right, never mind never being able to have vaginal sex again. And of course, the creators of this vaginal mesh knew this and then kind of joked amongst each other that women could have sex with other orifices instead of their vaginas. So like, it's you look at these documents, you're like, how was this possible? But they also sold what's known as a power morcellator. I talk about it at the end of the book, which was this little kind of blender device that was used for hysterectomies. And that doctors would insert to essentially blend up the uterus in a woman within her body. And the problem is that, as you know, endometrial cancer is actually hard to diagnose. And you can take a biopsy of a uterus in one place and miss the cancerous cells in another place. And so what happened with this little blender is that it would spit out these cancerous cells and essentially send them all over a woman's abdomen and make it impossible to treat this. And so 1 in 300 women who had this procedure ended up getting cancer, and in most cases dying, because the blender essentially sent the cancer throughout her body. And the company knew this and continued to sell it. So they attacked the uterus, they attacked the vaginal walls. They're one of the largest sellers of breast implants, and they refused to document what they knew were problems with their breast implants for decades. And the FDA finally, last year or the year before, put a warning on breast implants saying that they could cause a particular form of cancer. These kinds of breast implants. Again, information that Johnson & Johnson sat on for years and years and years. Yes, yeah. And then, of course, there's baby powder, which many women used in their own underwear. And as you know, one of the risks of even small amounts of asbestos is that it causes ovarian cancer. So estimates are that somewhere around 1,500 women a year contract ovarian cancer just because of Johnson's baby. So it's a huge number of women who have died over the last century because this company sold this product and knew that it contained this very dangerous mineral in it.
Again and again, we're coming down to the fact that the company knew, the executives knew, and they willingly had a complete disregard for anything of morality, of law, no fear, and a company is almost built in the claim amount as part of what they may have to pay out. Especially in this case of Johnson & Johnson, the company has filed for bankruptcy 3 times. They've tried to they spun off another company. I mean, of course, you mentioned that so nicely. And they tried to build a trust so that they could limit their liability of how much they have to pay. And here, of course, the judiciary came in because the case was so huge. But courts don't come down to save people in every case. The talcum case became so large that, yes, the company is not having its way here.
Well, it's not yet having its way. I mean, there are still 93,000 claimants in the baby powder lawsuit area. Very few of them have had their claims adjudicated or resolved. The company tried to push it through the bankruptcy system because companies have enormous power in the bankruptcy system, more than they do in the United States in what's known as the regular tort system, the usual district courts in the United States. So they tried that route as we talk about 3 times. And the thing about bankruptcy is when you go in, all of the claims in the tort system are frozen. You cannot have your claim heard by a judge or a jury while a bankruptcy filing is ongoing. And so, the
buying time, basically.
Yeah, they're buying time. They're what they really wanted was for many of these claimants, many of these women to die. Because when someone is dead, they get less money than when they're alive. Because when you're alive, you can come before the court, juries see this very sympathetic figure, and in many courts, you can't get pain and suffering as an award when you're dead. Because you're obviously dead, you're not suffering anymore. You can only get pain and suffering when you're alive. So for Johnson & Johnson, delay is their friend, because as the years go by, more and more of these women die, and their payout goes down.
These are now something like the talcum powder is a harmless, seemingly harmless product. So was Tylenol. It was an OTC product, right? And OTC product by nature don't come with such heavy duty warnings because, as you also mentioned in your book, that the dose strength is such that if a person pops in a couple of extra pills, it should not make that much of a difference. But here they're already maxing out the dose. Like how did that got allowed, and where does it leave like so many people as marketing, as a sales and marketing person? I would say that we people hate warnings on drugs. Warning boxes, they scare away buyers and sales numbers go down. We would always want to hide behind the low incidence of adverse events. Oh, that's not much, a person can buy. But here also it seems that the number of death cases was piling and the FDA was dragging its feet here also.
Yeah.
Tell us more about the Tylenol case here.
Okay. Tylenol, as you know, the chemical name of the substance in Tylenol is acetaminophen. It was approved by the FDA and a lot of other places in the 1950s as a prescription product. And then the FDA approved over-the-counter sales right around 1960 because it seemed like it was sort of mostly pretty safe. But the initial over-the-counter sales approval was just for the 350 milligram pill, which is known as regular Tylenol strength. In the early years, the importance of Tylenol, we sort of forget the dangers of ulcers back in the day. Anu, you're not old enough, I think, to remember that in the 30s, 40s, and 50s and 60s, one of the most dangerous things in human health was ulcers. You could have a bleeding ulcer that could actually, there's a famous scene, I don't know if you ever watched Downton Abbey, but there's a famous scene in Downton Abbey where the Lord suddenly rises from the table, throws up blood, and collapses and nearly dies because he had, his peptic ulcer explode. And that was a terrible risk. And in the United States, George Bush, the first George Bush, the president, he had a bleeding ulcer in the 60s and 70s. And it was often the case that men who did international travel had the most ulcers. And it wasn't understood until the 1980s that that's because ulcers are actually caused by a common bacteria called H. pylori. And two Australian researchers actually discovered this and ended up winning a Nobel Prize because it was such a profound and had such a profound impact on human health. But what happened essentially in the 1960s is that there was this understanding that NSAIDs, the normal class of over-the-counter pain relievers that includes ibuprofen, Advil, aspirin, all of those medicines worsened ulcers, that they had an effect on the stomach lining that could make ulcers more serious or even cause ulcers. So in the late 60s and early 70s, there was this messaging that went out that said, if you have ulcers, you should not take aspirin or other NSAIDs. The sole exception was Tylenol. Tylenol does not seem to have an impact on the stomach lining, or it doesn't really have an impact on what are known as the COX inhibitor chain. These enzymes that play a role in pain and in inflammation and in your stomach lining. Acetaminophen seems to have an impact on what's known as the cannabinoid receptors, which is what those receptors that you get from smoking marijuana. So in the late 60s and early 70s, there was this real message coming out that Tylenol is actually the safest drug you can take because it doesn't make ulcers worse. And as a result, Tylenol sales soared in the 1970s. By the end of the 1970s, it was the biggest selling consumer drug in the world. Status it maintains to this day. But what wasn't known is that Johnson & Johnson in 1976 applied to the FDA to sell a more powerful version, extra strength Tylenol, 500 milligrams. And the reason is that Tylenol's great marketing strength, that it's safe, was also accompanied by this awareness that it didn't actually work that well. And that's a dose issue, that 350 milligrams, the regular strength, is only mildly effective. And so they wanted to up the strength. The problem is the drug is toxic in a way that no other over-the-counter medicine is, and it hurts livers. What Johnson & Johnson managed to get the FDA to do is to agree to the maximum dose that humans can take, which is 500 milligrams, 2 pills of 500 milligrams every 6 hours. And you cannot take more than that. If you take more than that, you might kill your liver. And in fact, to this day, Tylenol and acetaminophen writ large is by far the most common cause of liver failure and liver damage in the United States. And that's because they managed to persuade the FDA to allow over-the-counter sales of the maximum dose that is safe. No other over-the-counter medicine is allowed this. And in fact, FDA later allowed prescription drugs to have only 350 milligrams of acetaminophen, which turns the whole drug system on its head. It's supposed to be that prescription medicines you go up to a much higher dose than you can in over-the-counter medicines because you have a doctor involved. Maybe one of the most disturbing parts of the Tylenol story, Johnson & Johnson sold 2 different strengths of children's versions of Tylenol. They had a concentrated version for infants and a less concentrated version for children, and they didn't provide instructions to parents about which was which. They simply told parents to ask doctors. And it knew that doctors mixed these up all the time. And so again, through the 1970s, dozens, a bunch of babies died. We don't know how many, but it's probably dozens because these 2 concentrations got mixed up. And Johnson & Johnson wanted to keep selling the 2 concentrations because when you have a baby, you buy the infant formula version. And then when the infant grows up to be, more than an infant, like at
You
5,
move to
6
the
years
higher
old, you go to the
concentration.
children. They wanted parents buying the 2 different ones. And if that ended up killing some babies,
So be it.
that's the cost of business. They actually, an executive at trial admitted that they saw dead babies as simply a cost of doing business. To this day, extra strength Tylenol simply shouldn't be on the market, in my judgment. If you want to take regular strength Tylenol, fine. And also to this day, they market it as the safest of painkillers, even though what's happened since 1982 is that the risks of ulcers have simply gone away. We now know, or almost entirely gone away. We now know that if you have an ulcer, you can cure it with antibiotics.
Pylori drug.
Standard antibiotics.
Curiously, when you talk of ulcers and acidity, on the other end of the spectrum, not a J&J product, but another product, Zantac, also met with the same fate because of the extra strength and caused so much of destruction. I mean, I always say that the way the company went about it and the way FDA went about it caused heartburn in itself. I mean, how did they cause so much of damage?
Right. Well, and
Unbelievable.
thankfully now, there are, what are known as proton pump inhibitors, Prilosec, Prevacid, all these newer medicines. They are among the most effective medicines for a common ailment that have ever been sold. And they're now over the counter. And so if you have dyspepsia, basic heartburn, you can now get these medicines almost anywhere for very cheap. And they are almost 100% effective. So, as so far as we know. But so there really isn't a good reason for Tylenol and acetaminophen to be so widely sold. And certainly it's marketing as the safest, the one doctors choose the most, the one hospitals. I mean, the reason why acetaminophen and Tylenol are so dangerous is that people think it's so safe. So they don't worry if they take too much of it because they assume, this is the safest pill out there. I can take more. And it ends up costing them their livers and often their lives.
In India, this dose strength thing reminds me that in India, we have price controls depending on certain doses. So during the pandemic, there was a medicine which came out. I won't take the brand name, but usually marketed at 500 mg a dose. But this because till 500 mg, you have a price cap. This company decided to market 650 mg, and they took the brand and said, this is 650 because this is what you need during high fever and during COVID times. Not because you really need it, not because the body metabolizes 650 mg, but because there is no price control on the 650 mg. And it's sold like, and of course, the doctors' prescription pads are bought, and you know the story. It works the same time everywhere. So I think Tylenol, you've mentioned the death numbers, which are quite huge in itself, and very unsuspecting too. Very, very unsuspecting.
Yeah. And of course, we didn't even talk about the 1982 Tylenol poisoning case that you learned at MBA. But I retell that case, and Johnson & Johnson's behavior during that case was far from ideal. There is a lot of evidence suggesting that Johnson & Johnson was paying off the FDA commissioner of the day, and that as a result of those payoffs, the FDA was essentially in cahoots with Johnson & Johnson to make sure Johnson & Johnson's role in that case was never uncovered. So, in fact, there's a new Netflix documentary out in which I'm featured called The Tylenol Murders that goes into a lot of this history as well. But, what's remarkable about that story, Anu, is how Johnson & Johnson has been able to shape the narrative around its own image forever. And, I was a journalist at the top level of journalism, certainly in the United States, and I saw this firsthand. Johnson & Johnson's power, of course, resulted from the fact that it has not only prescription medicines, but it has all of these consumer medicines that are widely advertised in media. And so again and again and again and again, when reporters tried to do tough stories on Johnson & Johnson, the company's executives would call the headquarters of that media company and said, if you go ahead with this story, we're going to pull all of our ads. And the executives would call down to the newsroom and say, you're not doing that story. And again, as I talked about before, one of my targets is Johnson & Johnson, another is the FDA, a third is the professional class, but a fourth is the media. This is a story that was hiding in plain sight for decades. I did little pieces of it, but I failed again and again and again to do the wider story, even at the New York Times, because there simply wasn't appetite for it. And that what was true at the New York Times, I'm afraid, was true at every other place as well. This company's huge dominant position in healthcare, it is the largest healthcare products conglomerate in the world, allowed it to essentially silence or buy off almost every institution or individual that would have held it to account. I mean, one of the stories I tell, because I do have the grand jury files in some of these investigations into Johnson & Johnson, is I point out that in one of these, in the biggest investigation that led to the largest fine, 3 of the 4 prosecutors in charge of that case eventually went to work for law firms where Johnson & Johnson is one of their biggest clients. And what I point out is that these prosecutors deliberately did not prosecute individual Johnson & Johnson executives, despite overwhelming evidence that they had committed crimes and that those crimes had resulted in more than 1 million deaths, right? The biggest, costliest, deadliest criminal conspiracies in American history, and no individuals are prosecuted. Could it be because these prosecutors knew that if they went after executives, their own career prospects outside of government work would have been severely damaged? That's a question there's no answer for, but certainly the answer is suggested.
But isn't it something that we see in all kind of cases? Like, when I see media reporting on other products, like we were talking of Zantac, whether we're talking of J&J products, different products. At the end of the day, the media goes soft on pharma companies, and the FDA and the pharma has a revolving door. So a person could be an FDA commissioner after being the CEO of the very company that this person was supposed to regulate, and vice versa. So there's a lot of mess around here. I mean, this is much bigger than the financial mess that we are used to. The US created the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, to just regulate the financial crimes, but these kind of crimes are just going unnoticed. completely unnoticed.
Yeah, some people have compared my book to, I have a friend of mine, John Carreyrou, who wrote a great book called Bad Blood about the Theranos fraud. And that was a book essentially about a small testing company, blood testing company that took, pinpricks of blood and supposedly brought back, real results, but in fact faked the results. And it, led to series on TV, and it was sort of, actually the Theranos story is entirely a financial fraud story. No, as far as we know, no one was harmed. And the fraud cases that people remember, certainly in the United States, is Enron, Geico, WorldCom, these companies that made up their financial numbers, and investors lost money, and those companies and the executives involved in them were all prosecuted because there was just a huge amount of outrage that these people essentially stole money. And for me, it's crazy that that is what gets so much attention. Johnson & Johnson has stolen that much more money and more, billions of dollars, because it's lied about the safety and efficacy of its products. But in addition to that, there have been 2 million deaths. Tyco, WorldCom, Theranos, all these other large fraud cases that have gotten so much attention, nobody died. Why is that? Why do those cases get so much attention? Because investors lost money and they're angry. Aren't you like a little more angry when your baby dies? When your grandparent dies? When your wife is crippled for the rest of her life and is dripping blood everywhere? Like, hello?
That is surprising. It breaks your heart to see the amount of damage a small little fraud, small little clinical trial manipulation, some data massaging here and there can do to such a vast chunk of people. Coming back to your book, because I do want to stick to the book. You talk of 60,000 young boys growing breasts, and it was going unreported because look at what they did with the clinical trial numbers. They changed the denominator to include both girls and boys, and suddenly the product was not very dangerous, so as to say. The numbers, the ratios, so easy to change it.
Right, a simple math, just blanket fraud. And what's interesting, of course, is the authors of that paper have continued on. Robert Findling, Dr. Robert Findling, the lead author of that paper, was the head of Johns Hopkins psychiatry department until very recently, is now at VCU. August person continuing on. The departments at Harvard that came up with this nonsense diagnosis of pediatric bipolar illness is still widely recognized as the top child psychiatric department in the world. And they helped create this fraud that is arguably the largest pediatric drug disaster ever. It's just sort of astonishing, the lack of accountability for almost any of these actions in these cases.
And that case of the ADHD medicine used in two of the most vulnerable populations, adolescents and elder care. I mean, just literally killing off people in elder care because the nurses don't want to see them shouting or howling or making too much of noise. I mean, that's the thing we get.
And I point this out in the book in sort of almost an aside, but remember how COVID swept through nursing homes, particularly in the United States. And it was this, nursing homes became these death chambers. Well, one way that drug, Risperdal, kills elderly people is by making them more susceptible to respiratory infections. What is COVID? COVID is a respiratory infection. A huge share of nursing home patients are given Risperdal and similar medicines inappropriately, as we talked about. Why did so many die during the COVID pandemic in nursing homes? Could it be because Johnson & Johnson's criminal conspiracy, and in this case, of course, Johnson & Johnson admitted that its marketing actions were criminal. And as I point out, the grand jury files show that Johnson & Johnson knew that this product was going to kill elderly patients, knew that it didn't actually help them, but, bribed psychiatrists to prescribe it anyway. And then even when the FDA put a black box warning on the drug saying this will kill elderly patients and it won't help them, Johnson & Johnson continued to sell it to psychiatrists with two messages. One message was, you'll never get caught. No one will know that you're the person who killed this patient because they're going to die of heart attacks and strokes, and you won't be able to figure out whether they died of the heart attack and stroke because of your prescription or just naturally. So don't worry, you'll never be sued. And second, they said, if you really want to hide the reason for this, diagnose these patients with schizophrenia.
With schizophrenia. Yeah.
That instead of dementia or Alzheimer's, say that they have schizophrenia and thus they need this drug, which is approved for schizophrenia. And what happened, subsequent to this, is that the share of patients in American nursing homes diagnosed with schizophrenia soared. And right now, 1 in 9 patients in American nursing homes, at least 1 in 9 patients, is diagnosed with schizophrenia, when the actual share of schizophrenics in American nursing homes is probably 1 in 1,000. The thing about real schizophrenia is that it robs about 30 years of your life. Very few actual schizophrenics make it into their 60s and 70s. So almost none of these people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia actually have it. The diagnosis is just intended to hide the real reason for prescribing these medicines, which, as an FDA official told me off the record, is mass euthanasia with plausible deniability.
Mass euthanasia with plausible deniability. I mean, they come up with stuff which nobody can even think of. A normal person would not even think of such stuff, however clever we may be. And of course, we've spoken about the OTC drugs and, we've spoken about the ADHD medicine. It seems to me that, like they say, if you torture data long enough, it will confess to anything. And that is what's happening to pretty much all the products. Like the EPO case that you've mentioned has just 131 patients in trial.
Right. Well,
a bit more about that.
Okay. So EPO, also known as erythropoietin, most people know this drug because bicyclists started doping with it back early 90s. And Lance Armstrong famously used EPO, he and his team, to win 7 Tours de France. And this all subsequently came out in court proceedings, and he has now admitted to it. So that's why people know about EPO, is its role in sports. But actually, the biggest use of EPO has been in cancer. It was originally developed. Basically, EPO, erythropoietin, is this hormone that stimulates your own blood marrow to produce red blood cells. And when you're anemic, you need more red blood cells. Red blood cells are the things that carry oxygen through your blood. And so the hope was, if you can spur the creation of more red blood cells, instead of treating anemia as we often do with iron supplements, oftentimes
you get the body to do it
transfusions, right? You can get the body to do this naturally. And the original market for EPO was thought to be exclusively in kidney dialysis because, as you know, when you lose kidney function, kidneys filter your blood. So you have to create this filtering system outside of the body. That's called dialysis. But the problem with dialysis is that it often kills red blood cells. Red blood cells don't get through the filtering mechanism, and it's been known for a long time that kidney dialysis patients will become anemic. So the first thought was, rather than give dialysis patients routine blood transfusions who have their own set of risks, we'll give them EPO. And so Johnson & Johnson licensed this medicine from Amgen and sold it. Its rights were across the world instead of in the United States. But Johnson & Johnson was not happy with the profits they were making from this. And they came up with this idea, well, how about, cancer patients often get anemic because they take chemotherapeutics that are very toxic, and those chemotherapeutics often kill red blood cells, making people very briefly anemic. Why don't we sell it to cancer patients as kind of a pick-me-up? And they did this one tiny little trial, as you said, with 131 patients, showing that if you give cancer patients EPO, it increases their red blood cell count, or what's known as hematocrit or hemoglobin count. And FDA saw this, proved it, and they started selling EPO to cancer patients, and it quickly became the biggest selling drug ever. It was expensive, and in the United States, half of all cancer patients were prescribed EPO. Now, a big reason for that is that in the United States, oncologists, who are the doctors who treat cancer patients, get half of their income from the drug markups for the drugs they provide patients.
The commissions that they get.
So oncologists serve as both doctor and pharmacist to their cancer patients. And since EPO was so expensive, they were making half of their income just from EPO. So the oncologist in the 90s and 2000s in the United States made about $300,000 a year in their practice. And then they made another $300,000 a year just prescribing EPO. So it was this bonanza. And Johnson & Johnson did all kinds of things to encourage more prescriptions by putting more drug in the vials and telling the government there was this much and giving doctors this much so that they could then take the freebies, give it to patients, and then bill the government as if they'd paid for the whole thing. It was insurance fraud at a massive level. And I actually talked to the prosecutors who eventually looked into this. And they brought in some hospital executives, some doctors, like, did you know that you were doing insurance fraud? And of course, they sort of refused to answer those questions. But these hospitals, in fact, ended up hiring what are known as compounding pharmacies to repackage the EPO just so they could more efficiently sell that extra as if they'd paid for it. So it was knowing fraud, and it was on a massive level, and everybody was involved in cancer. So the prosecutors sort of told me, like, Gardiner, there was nothing we could do. We're not going to haul every cancer doctor in the country and every cancer hospital in the country into court. So we just sort of, so it was huge fraud. And what very few people knew, only Johnson & Johnson and Amgen knew, is that they were running these clinical trials in cancer patients. And what was happening, what these trials were showing, is that the patients who were getting EPO were dying at a much more rapid rate than the patients who didn't get EPO. And of course, there are laws for them. They are required to disclose these kind of results to the FDA, and Johnson & Johnson simply refused. Even more appallingly, every single researcher, many of them in these august medical schools involved in these trials, didn't say a word either. So again, what we talked about was the collaboration of academia and doctors in these frauds. It was just extraordinary. Trial after trial after trial was done. Hundreds at the end of this process. Certainly dozens and scores and perhaps hundreds of researchers knew the real results and kept secret, while hundreds of thousands of Americans were killed. The estimate that some epidemiologists gave me is that at least 500,000 Americans died as a result of this. So
this is like the murder on the Orient Express, right? This is like murder on the Orient Express. Everybody has a cut and a share and is in the system. I'll take one last minute because you do refer towards the end of your book, you do talk of some reforms, and I know you've been part of the Sunshine Act and how that came about. I mean, with that already in place, isn't the story repeating with now the weight loss drugs where whining and dining of doctors is happening, and influencer marketing is happening? It's for everybody to see, but still truth is hiding in plain sight. Like, it's repeating. What reforms? How to reform the FDA? How to reform the system? What are your suggestions?
So I do have a whole series of suggestions at the end of the book. I personally think that the government needs to ban payments from drug companies to doctors. Every study ever been done on these practices show that it makes doctors worse at their jobs. It just has to stop. These are, marketing payments. They endanger patients. They're widespread. More than $2 billion a year in such payments are made in the United States every year. It needs to stop. Second, I think the government needs to create a new agency, not the FDA. In the United States, there's two agencies that regulate air travel. There's the FAA that approves new planes, but when there's a crash, the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, comes in and gives an independent assessment about why the crash happened. And the understanding is that the FDA, which approved this plane, has a conflict of interest and can't look at what's wrong with the plane once it's in use. And I think that the same thing needs to happen in drugs and devices. The FDA can approve these drugs and devices, although I think the FDA needs to get its money from general revenues, the government, not from the industry. But I think there needs to be a separate agency that essentially looks at the safety of approved products once they're on the market. And it's a scandal that there are all these data from Medicare, from elsewhere, that you could use to examine the safety of these products that essentially is never consulted because the government doesn't want to know. The government does not want to know when these products are killing people instead of saving them because, of course, it shows that their original decision was mistaken. And that's why in airplane crashes, we have these two different set of investigators. And I think the same thing needs to happen in medicine. Those are my two. I have other suggestions, of course.
You have a long list, yeah. We'll ask our readers to read the book. May I have one picture of you with the book, please?
Sure. Sorry.
Thank you so much for your time. And
sure.
Lovely to have you
thanks
here.
For your interest.
It was a pleasure to have you here.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.